presentation. This is the first time I've really done a program specifically on bridge cameras. I've incorporated bridge cameras into other programs and talked about them, but this is the kind of the first time I'm doing it on specifically bridge cameras. So feel free to ask as many questions as you'd like. I know JR did submit a bunch to me already, which I have already embedded into my presentation, which I will go over, and then we can address more questions at the end. But really, this is just going to be a general overview of bridge cameras, some of the common features, some of the similarities between them, some of the differences, what to look for, and just kind of give you a general overview of what to expect. There's a lot of different bridge cameras out there on the market. I will say they are getting fewer and further between, as maybe where they were 5, 6, 7 years ago. You're starting to see people kind of get away from them a little bit, but there are still plenty of options out there to choose from. So feel free to use the chat, ask as many questions as you'd like. After I get through the program and address the questions that were already asked previously, I'm happy to answer any new questions that do come in. But again, I want to thank you, Jay, for getting this all set up. I want to thank the Audubon Everglades for having me here. And let me go ahead and share my screen and we can get into it. So I first want to start off by introducing myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Noah Buchanan, and I work for Hunts Photo and Video. If you guys are not familiar with Hunts, we're a photo and video retail company based out of New England. We actually have 8 retail stores throughout New England in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Maine. And Maine is actually where I am based out of. Typically on a normal year, prior to last March, I was on the road almost every other week, doing a lot of trade shows, photography conferences, and different photography events all over the country. I'm sure some of you know Gary Farber. I work very closely with him and do a lot of the same events that he attends, and I've been working with him for the past 3 years. But have been with Hunts almost 5 years now. This coming August will be 5 years, which is crazy to think how quickly time has flown by. Prior to going to Hunts and working for Hunts, I was actually in school for photojournalism at the New England School of Photography in Boston. Wanted to be a photojournalist. Still would like to be one day if I could find a job opportunity that actually pays a reasonable living, and not eating ramen noodles and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to survive. But that's really one of the main reasons that I actually started at Hunts in the beginning, is because I was having such a difficult time finding a photojournalism job right out of school that I started working at Hunts because I needed some sort of income. And I have just enjoyed it so much that I've been here ever since. It's provided me with so many amazing opportunities, and I love talking about photography, especially when it comes to cameras and lenses and just the photography equipment. I'm definitely a gearhead. I'm sure many of you are as well. I love talking about the gear and equipment and getting to play around with it and sharing my knowledge with everybody else. So again, if you guys have any questions, put them down in the chat. I will address all those at the end. I won't be able to see it while I'm presenting right now, but I will get to all of those at the end, and we can open it up to a big Q&A. I am perfectly fine with that. So let's go ahead and get into it here. So bridge cameras. What is a bridge camera? That is kind of first and foremost what I want to talk about. And how is it different from a point and shoot? How is it different from a DSLR? How is it different from a mirrorless? What is a bridge camera first and foremost? And what are some of the key features? What are you going to be looking for? Or what are some of the key features of these bridge cameras? So one, it's going to be a fixed lens cameras. Bridge cameras, you cannot take lenses on and off. That lens is permanently attached to the camera itself. And I saw somebody had asked down in the chat, because a bridge camera has a fixed lens, can you clean the sensor? And the answer is technically yes, but no. You can send these cameras in. Sometime dust and debris can actually get sucked into the camera itself. It's not very common. It is a possibility, in which case that the normal person is not able to get in there and clean the sensor. You need to basically send it back to the manufacturer. They're going to disassemble it, clean the sensor, and reassemble it, which is basically like a huge repair cost. So typically, no, you're not cleaning these camera sensors, because dust is typically not getting onto them because of that fixed lens. And typically that fixed lens has a pretty wide zoom range, from very wide angle to super telephoto in some cases. So you have a huge range of focal lengths to work with, and it will vary from camera model to camera model how large that range actually is. But typically it's going to be a larger zoom range than your average lens for your DSLR or for your mirrorless camera. but you're going to get similar controls to a DSLR or mirrorless. So you're going to have manual shooting capabilities. You're going to be able to shoot in RAW. You can have aperture priority, shutter priority. You're going to have a lot of these same features that you've come to expect with a DSLR or mirrorless, all still built into these cameras. So you can actually learn and really adapt and grow into these cameras as well, which makes them very beginner friendly because they do have auto modes, and you can shoot these completely automatic where the camera is doing all the work. All you have to do is zoom in and out and press the shutter. Everything else the camera takes care of. So they're very beginner friendly. The menu systems are a little simplified, a little more simplified compared to some DSLRs and mirrorless, but there's room to grow. There's room to learn. You can learn how to shoot in aperture priority, learn how to shoot in shutter priority, and eventually make it up to full manual. So they're very beginner friendly. And I do see a lot of people, especially wildlife photographers or just birders in general, people who are birders but are looking to maybe again document some of what they're seeing, or to ID some of the birds that they're seeing, are usually typically using bridge style cameras. They may not consider themselves a photographer, but they're using that camera as a tool to actually document what they're seeing. And in many cases, that will lead them into a passion for photography. There's a lot of people that I've met through working at hunts who are birders, first and foremost, but have gotten into photography through that, which is really awesome. It's just bringing more people into this just amazing world that we live in. Photography is such an amazing community, and there's so much that you can do with it, that it's great to have these cameras that kind of, again, bridge the gap between a basic point and shoot camera and a higher end interchangeable lens camera. So it's kind of that nice middle ground where you're going to get some more advanced features, but still be pretty beginner friendly. And again, you have auto along with manual controls. And then lastly, smaller image sensors than DSLR or mirrorless. So that's a key thing to think about, is these image sensors are definitely smaller than your average DSLR or mirrorless camera. I should say than any DSLR or mirrorless camera. There's no bridge cameras that I'm aware of that will have the same sensor size as a DSLR or mirrorless interchangeable lens camera. They're all going to be smaller sensors, and that's for a few different reasons. So with that being said, who is a bridge camera for? And the answer is pretty much anyone, beginner photographers or advanced photographers. There's really a lot to be desired by these different models. There's different price points, different performance ranges that you can kind of look at, different features that you're going to get. So there really are bridge cameras for kind of any level of photographer that you are. Somebody who has a lot of photographic experience, but you're looking for maybe a all-in-one travel camera, and you don't want to carry around all your lenses and your big full-size DSLR or your mirrorless. Something like a bridge camera can really be a great way to travel light and to travel small. And you can save a lot of size and weight, but still get a very, very long telephoto lens in many cases, but you're not having to carry around the huge telephoto lens that you probably have for your DSLR or mirrorless. So they are very travel friendly. And they're also great for people looking to do some wildlife and some sports photography. And again, get that longer telephoto lens, but not spend thousands and thousands of dollars on a DSLR or mirrorless telephoto lens that you're going to be able to change in and out between cameras. Those lenses can get very, very expensive, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars. When you're looking at 600 millimeter, 500 millimeter prime lenses, you can spend tons of money. And many of these bridge cameras will go way further than those 500 and 600 millimeter lenses are even able to do. So you're getting even more reach than some of these $10,000 plus lenses on these bridge cameras. But there's some reasons why they are so much less expensive than those higher end prime telephoto lenses, like a fixed 500 or a fixed 600 millimeter lens. And that is really based on the sensor size itself. So this is kind of a chart breaking down some of the different sensor sizes, some of the different types of cameras that you're going to find that will fall into these sensor sizes. And bridge cameras fall right in these two right here, 1/2.3 and 1 inch. That's really where the bread and butter of these of these mirrorless cameras are. Losing my train of thought, going back to my mirrorless cameras program. This is really where the bridge cameras will fall, is a 1 inch sensor and a 1/2 sensor size. And in all reality, those are pretty small sensor sizes. A 1 inch sensor is getting to be a little bit better, but 1/2.3 is pretty small, especially when you look at this sensor size compared to something like a full frame sensor over here. Whether you have a full frame DSLR or a full frame mirrorless, you have so much more surface area to actually work with, a much larger file size. And that's going to allow you to do so much more editing, so much more processing, cropping down more without losing detail, making larger prints. So again, that is really where these bridge cameras are sacrificing, is in sometimes image quality because of the smaller sensor size. But there are some mirrorless cameras out there, or I've got to keep saying mirrorless cameras because I'm thinking of my mirrorless camera program. Excuse me there. I'm probably going to keep doing that because I give that presentation so frequently. But there are some bridge cameras out there that will have this 1-inch sensor size. And this is becoming more and more popular for a lot of reasons because they're still very similar in size to the 1/2.3 size cameras. But you're getting a larger image, you're getting more information to work with, you're getting better low light performance. So that 1-inch sensor size is really something to be sought after. Now, it does come with a little bit of a higher price point, and we'll get into some different models in a minute here. But you're able to actually get these super long telephoto lenses because these smaller sensor sizes have a larger crop factor. So you see with this line right here, what the crop factor is going to be. So being full frame, that's kind of the standard 1.0. So if you put a 100mm lens on a full frame camera, it's going to be a 100mm lens. But if you take that same 100mm lens and bring it all the way down here to the 1/2.3, that's now a 500mm lens, 560mm lens, because of that crop factor. So you can get these telephoto lenses to go super long distances because of that smaller sensor size. The lenses can be more compact. However, if you try to put a lens that large on a full frame camera, it's going to be so much more massive because you don't have that similar crop factor. So that's something to bear in mind. And that's how you're getting these super long telephoto lenses on these bridge cameras, is because of that crop factor, because of the smaller sensor size. So some of these super zoom bridge style cameras, they all have 1/2.3-inch sensors. Now, there are still some 1-inch sensor sized cameras that do have a decent telephoto zoom length on them, but they're not going to be the crazy like 2,000 or 3,000mm focal length, just because that sensor size won't allow for it. The camera would be so large. So for in order for them to keep it still a reasonable size, you have to kind of keep that focal length down a bit. So that's something to consider. Are you somebody who's going to be looking for a larger image sensor? So larger image sensor is going to give you better low light performance. It's going to allow you to make larger prints, but it's also going to allow you to crop in more. So again, while you may not be able to zoom as far as you would with a 1/2.3-inch censored camera, you're going to be able to crop in a little bit more because of that larger sensor. You have more information to work with, but it does, again, come at a premium. And there's a lot more bridge cameras in the 1/2.3-inch sensor size itself. So again, something to keep in mind. And just looking at this 1/2.3 is very close to your cell phone size sensor, 1/3.2. It's slightly larger than that. So that's something to be aware of. So you're not going to be able to make really massive prints out of those smaller cameras. You can still get very reasonable size prints, 11:14, maybe even a little bit larger, 16:20 size prints, and get usable images, but you're not going to be able to make really big, massive prints or do a lot of cropping because you don't have a lot of information to work with that smaller sensor size. So that's something to bear in mind. And that's really kind of how these bridge cameras are actually able to perform and how they're able to operate, being so small and so compact, but having such a long telephoto zoom lens on them. And I want to go into some of my favorite models, some kind of personal picks, and kind of go over some of the features of them, some of the similarities, some of the differences, and just kind of give you an idea of what's out there and what to look out for. And you may see these little yellow marks here. I'm not sure where those came from, and I'm not sure how to get rid of them. Let me see if I can do this. There they are. All right, there we go. Perfect. So pull that back up. Perfect. So Back to where I was, kind of going over some of my favorite models out there that are bridge cameras. Not really in any particular order. However, this first one happens to be one of my favorite, which is the Sony RX10 series camera, specifically the version 4. So this is the current model. This is a 20 megapixel 1-inch censored camera. So again, talking about that larger 1-inch sensor size, this is going to give you a little bit more resolution to work with, a larger file, make larger prints, etc. This has a Zeiss lens on it, which is really nice. So it has a really nice quality optic, and it's an f2.4 to f4 max. So at the max focal length, which is 600 millimeters, you're going to be at an f4. So you're getting a 600 millimeter f4 equivalent. And if you compare that to a 600 millimeter f4 lens on a full frame camera, those lenses typically run you about $12,000 and weigh anywhere from 10 to 15 pounds and are probably about, I don't know, 18 inches long. And they are massive. But you're getting that same 600 millimeter f4 equivalent, but again, it's a much smaller sensor that we're working with. That lens is designed for a full frame camera, which is why it has to be so physically large. But because of the smaller sensor, we can still get a 600 millimeter f4, but you're not going to get as much information as you would if you're using it on a full frame camera. But this is definitely kind of on the higher end scale, this RX10. This, in my opinion, is kind of the top tier bridge camera as far as performance and also price point as well. But there's a lot of features that are really desirable in it. It has a full 3-inch rotating touchscreen to use on the rear LCD. You can shoot 4K video. You can even do 1080p video up to 960 frames per second. So super slow motion video, which is really cool. So if you're looking to experiment more in the video, you have that capability. Very fast autofocusing system with 315 autofocus points. So really great when it comes to focus tracking. Up to 12,000 ISO and 24 frames per second continuous shooting. So really great for birding, really great for wildlife because of that fast focusing and also the fast continuous shooting. And then it also have built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and weighs in at 2.4 pounds. And I do have the weight at the bottom of all these. So that's something to kind of consider is the weight because there are definitely some that are heavier than others. And weight is definitely a factor to consider. So definitely keep an eye out of the weight of some of these. Going on to the next one from Panasonic and sticking with 1-inch censored cameras. This is very similar as far as features go to that Sony, but a few minor differences. Still a 20 megapixel 1-inch censored camera, but the zoom lens is now a Leica lens instead of Zeiss, and it has a 2.8 to f4.5. However, this one only goes out to 480 millimeters, so you're not getting that full 600. But it does mean it's a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter. You can still do 4K recording. It has up to, again, 25,000 ISO, 12 frames per second continuous shooting, so not quite as fast as the Sony, but still pretty darn fast. It does also have a manual zoom and a manual control ring, which is pretty cool. Another nice thing that this has is a built-in ND filter. So if it's a really bright sunny day, you can use that built-in ND filter to actually help you out a little bit as well. Comes in weighing at 2.13 pounds. Sticking with Panasonic again, but a slight step down from the previous one, the FZ1000 Mark II. The FZ1000 series has been really popular. The version 2 came out about a year or two ago and has been very popular as well. Still a 20 megapixel 1-inch censored camera, but now we only have a 400 millimeter equivalent zoom. So even shorter zoom, but again, it's going to be a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, about a little less than half a pound lighter than the 2500 and almost a pound lighter than the Sony. You still have the 3-inch LCD screen, 4K video. You have up to 12,000 ISO with 12 frames per second shooting, still Bluetooth and Wi-Fi connectivity. So you're going to see a lot of similarities with these specs and these features of these different cameras. And I don't list any pricing here. I know some of you may ask about pricing, and we can get into that a little bit. But pricing is always changing. If you guys are looking and interested in any of these cameras, I'm happy to work up special pricing for you guys. I know that's something that may come up, so I did just want to state that as well, that there's no pricing in any of these. And again, pricing does change almost monthly for these cameras. So if it's ever something you're in the market for, always reach out to me. I'm happy to work up any special pricing at any time whenever you guys are looking for anything. And then going on to a pair of cameras that are very unique. The Nikon P950, which was previously the P900, and the P1000. Now, these are both current cameras. These are both cameras that you can still buy brand new, and they are almost identical besides the lens. So the P950, which I have the specs listed here on the left, and the P1000, I have the specs listed on the right. Really, the biggest difference is the lens. So the P950 will give you a 2000 millimeter equivalent focal length, and the P1000 will give you a 3000 millimeter equivalent focal length. Now, note, we don't have that 1-inch sensor anymore. We had to drop down to the 1/2.3-inch sensor, and that's allowing us to get that larger telephoto zoom. Now, these cameras can get pretty heavy. You'll notice down at the bottom 2.1 pounds or 2.21 versus 3.1 pounds. That is because of how large that lens actually is. Now, for a 2000 millimeter and a 3000 millimeter equivalent, it's really not that large at all. If you were to compare it to something like a full frame, which just doesn't exist, they don't make any full frame lenses that long. They would be way too big. They would be way too expensive. They just don't exist. So these cameras are awesome if you need that extra reach. Now, all the way out at 2000, all the way out at 3000 is very hard to use because any little bit of movement or any little bit of shake is going to change your field of view so dramatically that they can be very hard to use. And that's something that it sounds very attractive on paper. Oh my God, 2000 millimeters or 3000 millimeters. But it's actually very difficult to use, especially if you're photographing a small subject. Even the slightest bit of movement and that subject can go out of the frame. So that's something to consider as well. Yes, they do have great telephoto capabilities, but they can be very hard to use. When it comes to the aperture, you're looking at an f2.8 to f8. So all the way at 3000 millimeter, you're not getting a lot of light. So you really need to be shooting these in daylight. These cameras don't perform very well at these long telephoto lenses at dawn or at dusk or even at night. F8 is very hard to utilize when it's dark out. So you really want to be utilizing these in bright daylight. That's where they're going to perform best. They don't have quite as much resolution as the others. These only have a 16 megapixel sensor. They only go up to 6400 ISO. Another limiting factor is they only have 7 frames per second continuous shooting. So it doesn't have a very fast burst rate. So while it may be good for birding because of the focal length of it, if you're doing any birds in flight, you're not getting a very fast burst rate. So that's something to consider as well. They both have very high resolution viewfinders. So the viewfinders are very high resolution. You're jumping up in screen size to a 3.2-inch screen, built-in 4K video recording. So a lot of similar features there. But really the biggest difference is, again, the smaller sensor size on these, which is allowing for the much larger telephoto zoom. And also you have to consider the weight. They definitely get to be a little bit heavier. And they're not going to perform as well in lower light at the longer focal length because of the high f-stop that you're going to be at. But again, if you're somebody who's shooting really primarily in the daylight and can benefit from having a longer telephoto lens, this may be something worth checking out, but it will take a little bit of practice, especially when you're using it at those super telephoto ends. They can be a little bit tricky and a little bit hard to work with. Definitely suggest using it on a tripod if you can. That can always help stabilize it a bit as well. Another really popular series, which has been popular for a long, long time, is the Canon SX series. The SX60 was probably like one of the most popular ones in the lineup, and a lot of people who use the SX60 want them to bring it back. It was just such a great camera. And the SX70, excuse me, is very similar. Some slight differences, just the current version that's out right now. But the SX line from Canon has been very popular. They are very compact. They're very small. They're very lightweight. Compared to the Nikon, you're jumping up in your resolution up to 20 megapixels, but you're still sticking with that 1/2.3-inch sensor. So still the smaller sensor size. And they cut down on the zoom quite a bit compared to the two Nikon, where this one only goes out to 1300 millimeters, which in all reality is still very, very long. And you can do a ton with 1300 millimeter zoom equivalent. And it's a much smaller and more compact setup. So it really does appeal for people looking to travel. But again, with the smaller sensor size, you have to be cautious about low light and how big of prints that you excuse me, how big of prints that you actually want to make. So definitely be aware of that. Still a 2.3 million dot viewfinder, so very high resolution viewfinder, 4K video recording, built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And this one will actually do up to 10 frames per second continuous shooting, so a little bit faster, which is nice. But it only comes in at 1.3 pounds, so very, very light compared to the couple of other ones that we've already looked at. Then that brings us to the FZ80, which is kind of the Panasonic equivalent of the SX70. Very similar features, but this one actually has an 18 megapixel sensor, so slightly less resolution, but still the 1/2.3 inch sensor. This one has a 1200 millimeter equivalent zoom, so very comparable in zoom range. But the viewfinder is not as high resolution. So the viewfinder is a little bit lower resolution, as well as the rear LCD screen. So they're skimping out a little bit on those two features. You do still have 4K video recording and built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, still 10 frames per continuous shooting. Another cool feature this has is built-in focus stacking. So if you're doing any close-up photography, you can do some focus stacking as well, and comes in weighing only 1.3 pounds. And then those are, again, those are just some of my kind of favorite models. There's others out there. If you want to ask questions on any other specific models, I'm happy to address some more specific camera model questions, but those are some of my favorite. And I think it does cover a good kind of gamut of kind of the higher end, more expensive ones to the lower end, more budget friendly, and kind of a few in between, and covering a variety of different features for whatever style of photography that you may be doing. Now, I had mentioned that I worked in some of these commonly asked questions. These are the questions that Jay had forwarded over to me. So they're common with you guys because you're the ones who asked them. But a lot of these were really good questions. And I will kind of wanted to break them down one by one. And then we can go into some other questions that you guys have, go into some more details. But this just does cover a really good kind of overview of what these bridge cameras are capable of. So first and foremost, what are the best settings for bird photography? And that's really dependent on what type of bird photography that you're going to be doing. If your birds are in flight, I would definitely recommend shutter priority. Being able to prioritize your shutter speed to make sure it's fast enough to capture any birds in movement, any birds in flight. Shutter priority is going to be the easiest one to use. You may not have to worry as much about your aperture or as much about your ISO, especially if you're in good lighting situations. So that's going to be very easy and very simple. You want to make sure you have a fast enough shutter speed. If you're photographing a bird that's just sitting and doing more of a bird portrait, aperture priority is great for that. You can really focus on your depth of field, blurring out the background a little bit. Don't have to worry as much about your shutter speed because your subject is physically just standing still. It's not moving. Another thing to consider is also your focusing mode. If you're just doing more of a bird portrait, the bird isn't flying, it's just kind of sitting still. Single point focus is perfectly fine. You don't have to go into anything more really advanced than that. You can have a single point and put it exactly where it needs to be on the bird's eye to make that as sharp as possible. You have more time to work and really kind of set that up so it's accurate. But if you're going to be photographing birds in flight, using continuous focus is definitely something that I recommend. So the camera is going to be constantly hunting for their subject. It's going to be moving the focus points all around to actually follow and track it. If you just have single point focus, it's going to have a very hard time to try to follow and track that moving subject. So it really does depend. Is the bird in flight or is it sitting still? So just a couple of things to consider. This one was a little bit more specific, but I thought it was a good question to cover. I know they asked specifically about the SX70, but I think this does kind of go over just every bridge camera or any camera in general. And how long should the SX70 or any bridge camera for that instance last? And it really does depend how you're taking care of your camera, how the camera is being stored, how you're utilizing it, how much you're using it. You can have a camera that can last you a lifetime. And it's never going to break. It'll completely last you really as long as you need it to last if you're taking good care of it. And you're keeping it cleaned, making sure to keep it away for any dirt or dust, or keeping it away from the beach, or if you're going to the beach, wiping out any sand or any salt water. Keeping good care of your camera is always important. Keeping it in a dry, cool environment, keeping it away from humidity is a good thing as well. So just kind of just general things, just kind of keep good care of your camera. There's not really a shelf life for these cameras, but some of them will have a sensor or a shutter life on them. A lot of these bridge cameras don't have a shutter life expectancy as some higher end cameras do, but typically it's tens of thousands of images that you're going to be able to capture before the sensor may possibly break. It's just like how long is a car engine going to last? And it really depends how well you take care of it. Sometimes something can go wrong. You can only get maybe 50,000 miles. Or you can have a car that can run hundreds of thousands of miles and still perform great. So it will vary from camera to camera. Sometimes things can go wrong. Sometimes technical issues can happen. So it's tough to say. Your usage will vary. But overall, these cameras should be lasting you quite a bit of time. Now there may be new cameras coming out with newer features and newer settings and better performance, but that doesn't mean your camera is going to perform any worse, which kind of brings me to the last point of this question is, do the quality of photos degrade over time? And the answer is no. The sensor is not going to degrade over time. Your image quality will be just as good from the first photo that you take to the last photo that you take with the camera. You're not going to see any degradation of images over time. So that's something to consider as well and something to be aware of. If that person who asked that question is having issues with your camera specifically, send me an email. I have my contact information at the end if you're having kind of specific issues with that, that kind of relate along those terms. Reach out to me and we can try to figure that out and see what may be going on. Tips for shooting in lower light conditions. And this is tough because these bridge cameras are really not designed for shooting in low light conditions because of the smaller sensor size. First, flash can definitely help. Most of these cameras will have a hot shoe on it, so you can connect a flash. So using an off-camera flash, or technically an on-camera flash, I should say, can definitely benefit you. There's something called a MagMod Wildlife Kit, which is basically like a flash extender. So for photographing birds and wildlife at a distance, using a flash with the MagMod Wildlife Kit is really going to help to illuminate your subject. So that's one thing to consider. And also tripod for slower shutter speeds and non-moving birds. So again, if you are going to be shooting a bird that's just kind of perched, that's not moving and not flying, using a tripod can definitely help to get you a slower shutter speed, but still keep your camera still and steady enough to capture a sharp image of that bird. However, if you're in a low light situation and your only option is to handhold, it can be tough. You're going to have to boost up that ISO, and some of these cameras will have better high ISO noise performance. Typically, the 1-inch sensored cameras are going to perform much better in low light because they're going to be able to absorb more light because it's a larger sensor. And just good editing. Lightroom is so good now at image correction when it comes to any noise reduction. Nik softwares, you can even use Topaz. They have some really great denoise, the Topaz denoise I know a lot of people will use. So there's a lot of good softwares out there that really help reduce your grain and the noise in your images. That can be a factor with these bridge cameras. Is low light conditions can be pretty tough to work with. How do bridge cameras hold up against challenging conditions such as high humidity or salt spray? You got to be careful. High humidity is definitely something you want to avoid with any camera. Some cameras, all these cameras, I should say, do have some weather sealing to them to some extent. Some will have more than others. None of them are fully weather sealed because of that lens moving in and out. Dust and moisture and dirt can get in there. So they're not fully weather sealed. So you do have to be aware of that, especially salt spray. Salt spray is very dangerous because of that salt can be very damaging to your camera, to your lens. So if you're going out and shooting on the beach or near the beach, take just a moist towel, wipe down your camera. If you have some lens cleaning solution, spray that onto a microfiber cloth, wipe down the front of your lens, make sure your element is clean after you go out and shooting. You don't have any salt specks on there because that can damage your camera over time. So really just make sure you keep taking good care of your camera, cleaning it after you're going out and using it, and trying to avoid high humidity and salt and dirt and sand as much as possible. But if you do happen to run into any of that, definitely go ahead and clean it out. Salt and dirt and dust. One of these blowers here, if you can see my screen, one of these rocket blowers, as we talked about when we just hopped on, are very beneficial for cleaning off any dirt or any dust. Don't use the canned air on your camera. That canned air can possibly damage it. Use just one of these kind of manual air blowers to blow off any dirt or any dust that you may have. Moving up from that, is there a best image size and quality that is best for recommended use? And shooting a raw and uncompressed file is going to give you the most information to work with in the largest file size. So I always recommend shooting in raw. It's very easy to process raw files with Lightroom. You can even get a DNG converter. Even if you don't have Lightroom, you can download the Adobe DNG converter and convert it to a DNG file, which is going to be more universally read. But I always recommend to shoot in raw. It's going to give you the most information to work with when it comes to editing and processing your images. So I always recommend shooting in raw. And compressed versus uncompressed, that's kind of up for discussion. An uncompressed raw file is just going to give you a little bit more information, where a compressed raw file will be slightly less, slightly smaller file size, won't take up as much room on your computer or as on your memory card. But again, I always recommend shooting in raw for the best quality possible. What metering mode is recommended for bird photography? It really depends on what type of birds that you're going to be photographing. If you're photographing a very bright white bird, typically if you're on evaluative metering, where it's going to kind of evaluate your entire scene, it's probably going to overexpose that bird because it's so bright and white, and it's taking in a overall reading from the entire frame. If you're photographing a very dark bird, same thing. So spot metering can definitely be very good for birds that aren't moving. If you can really kind of lock down the spot metering, that's going to meter the exact point of where your focus point is. So spot metering for non-moving birds, just perched birds, can be very beneficial. But if you're doing anything moving, any birds in flight, I would say evaluative metering is going to work a little bit better. It's going to evaluate your entire scene to give you the proper exposure. Different autofocus options. So single and continuous autofocus are standard with all these cameras. So you can just have single point autofocus, where you just press the shutter button or press the shutter button down halfway. It's going to focus and it's going to lock on that focus. And then you go ahead and take the image. But if you have continuous focus on, you can press that shutter button down halfway and continue just to hold it pressed down halfway. And it's going to continue to follow and track. And the focus is going to continue to be hunting and searching. So those are kind of the two main focus options that you have. Again, birds in flight, moving subjects, continuous focus is probably going to be more friendly and a little bit easier to use and capture more images. But non-moving subjects, single point autofocus is perfectly fine. And it's going to allow you to, again, just put a single focus point wherever your image is, and just one half press of the shutter, lock in that focus, and then boom, you press the shutter all the way and you take your image. So those are kind of the two main focusing options that you have when it comes to these bridge cameras. And then recommended image aspect ratio. Excuse me, 1 second. Recommended image aspect ratio, and that's really a personal preference, however you want the aspect of your image to be. Standard for your sensor size is 2:3. That's going to be your standard aspect ratio. That's what your sensor is. It's a 2:3. So that's what you're going to get out of camera. Anything other than that, you're going to be cropping in a little bit, whether you're doing 4:3 or 16:9 for more of a panoramic, or a square 1:1. That's really up to you and up to your image and your own editing style and your own creative outlet. So I really don't have a recommended image aspect ratio. It's really what you find most appealing and what works best for your image. But again, 2:3 is the standard size of a sensor. So that's going to be the standard aspect ratio that you're going to start with. And then past that, any aspect ratio that you want to use, that's going to be suitable for your image. That's completely up to you and your creative vision for that photograph. And then a couple more questions here. Are there specific camera features that you would recommend to consider when buying a bridge camera? And really the biggest one is look for the larger 1-inch sensor. It's really good for shooting in low light. It's going to allow you to crop in more. It's going to allow you to make larger prints. So I do really recommend the larger 1-inch sensor. But right now, the largest focal length that you're going to get with the 1-inch sensored camera is 600 millimeters. And sometimes that's not long enough. So you kind of have to factor what's more important to you, the larger sensor size or the ability to zoom in further. And that's a decision that you're going to have to make yourself and the type of photography that you're doing. If you're only shooting during the day and have plenty of available light, going with something like these smaller 1/2.3-inch sensored cameras that have a longer zoom may be more beneficial. But if you're doing a mix of photography, some early morning, late in the evening, different styles of photography, something like a 1-inch sensor is going to be more versatile. So that's really the main specific feature that I would look for is the sensor size for the style of photography that you're going to be using. Preferred setting for flying birds. So that's a couple of quick things. Shutter priority, so you can really prioritize your shutter speed, being in continuous autofocus, continuous shooting, and matrix metering. Again, evaluative metering is going to evaluate the whole entire scene. So you're continuously focusing on the moving subject. You have a shutter priority, so you're making sure your shutter speed is fast enough to freeze that action. And then you also have burst on, so you can press down that shutter and it's really going to take a burst and follow and track your moving subject the entire time. That would be my go-to kind of setup if I were to photograph birds in flight, not just with bridge cameras, but honestly, probably with any camera. Now, that's going to give you some of the best chance for success. But again, results may vary. Some people prefer to shoot in fully manual, which is perfectly fine, just requires a few more steps to go in and set everything yourself. And then last one, is it possible to get a true macro? So to the best of my knowledge, there's no bridge cameras out there that have a true one-to-one macro lens. If there are and that you know of one, let me know, but I was not able to come across any. A lot of these cameras do have close-up focusing capabilities, so you can get very close and do some close-up photography, but a true macro lens is going to have one-to-one magnification, and there's no one-to-one magnification bridge cameras that I am personally aware of. But what you can do to get even closer is always add on like a macro close-up filter, a magnifying filter. That's going to allow you to get even closer to your subject to get more macro style photography. So that's something to consider as well when you're looking at these cameras. And then lastly here, this is just my contact information. Then we can go into some questions and some Q&A. But if you guys have any follow-up questions after tonight, that's my email address, our website, our Facebook page, Instagram, and YouTube channel. Feel free to take a photo of this with your cell phone or take a screenshot of with your computer or a screenshot with your iPad or whatever that you may be using to watch this, this webinar, just to have that information saved and on hand in case you need it in the future. Reach out to me anytime that you guys need anything. I am more than happy to help out with any questions that you have. Again, as I had mentioned earlier, I didn't list any pricing for any of these cameras in here. Prices will vary and can vary pretty dramatically in some cases, but I'm happy to work up special pricing for you guys. If you're looking and are in the market for anything, please do reach out, and I'm happy to work up pricing for all of you. But let me go ahead and unshare my screen, and we can address any questions that have come down into the chat.
Okay, I'll go ahead and read out some questions.
Sure.
No,
Yeah.
I see Jay hasn't unmuted himself yet. Okay, one question for those of you who joined in later in the presentation is bridge cameras don't have lenses that detach, so no need to clean the sensor. And Noah responded correct. That question is from Susan Young. Charlene and Rich ask, how can I best use my Canon PowerShot SX65HS for night or low light shots? It appears I can only set in manual 2 of the 3 settings, such as ISO or aperture.
So if you're in full manual, that should give you the capability of adjusting all 3. So that's strange that it's not allowing you to do that. It's possible that you could have your ISO set at auto in the menu system. So your ISO is just automatically setting itself. You can still be in auto ISO, but in full manual mode. So that's one possibility. Outside of that, I'm not 100% sure why it's only allowing you to shoot or change just 2 of them, which means to me the other one is automatically adjusting based on those other 2 settings that you're making. So That's something that if you want to follow up with an email, if it's not the ISO being on automatic, we can try to figure that out a little bit more into detail. But again, for low light shooting, it's going to be tricky. These cameras have a smaller sensor size, so they're not going to perform great at higher ISOs. So shooting on a tripod where possible is always a benefit. If you can use a flash, where you're going to be photographing, if your image allows for it, that can definitely help out as well. Other than that, working with a good denoise software to help reduce some of the higher ISO noise that you're going to see is always a benefit as well.
Okay,
Go ahead, Alan.
Kristen. Go ahead, Jay.
Well, go ahead.
Okay, Kristen writes, what about f-stops on the Canon SX70 and Panasonic FZ80? Kristen, I'm not quite sure if you mean how fast the lenses are, meaning how large of an aperture they go to. I don't know if you'd like to unmute to expand on your question for Noah.
If that is the question, the fastest aperture, let me see if I can pull it up
Yes,
on the.
That's what I meant. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, the SX70 is a 3.5 to 6.5 aperture. So it's going to be a shifting aperture. So it's 6.5 all the way at like 1300 millimeters, and you're at 3.5 when you're down at, I believe the widest is 21 millimeters wide. So it's shifting aperture. And the 780, I am not familiar with the 780. Maybe it was the FZ80. Maybe it was the FZ80 that you were probably referring to, would be my guess. If I'm reading into
780
that
or
wrong.
something, I think.
So if there's the FZ80 is a 2.8 to 5.9 shifting aperture, so a little bit faster on the wider end. Also a 20 millimeter wide angle equivalent at 2.8.
Thank you.
Okay. Joe asks, and you sort of covered this, Noah, which camera is best for shooting wildflowers?
Something with I would go with something with a larger 1-inch sensor. It's going to give you more detail, more information to work with, especially early in the morning, later in the evening, getting some of that kind of golden light, shooting at a more reasonable ISO. I would go with something that has a 1-inch sensor for doing wildflowers. You can definitely get away with something with a smaller sensor, but you may struggle a little bit at higher ISOs. All of these have pretty similar close focusing capabilities. Again, none of them have true macro, but you can always get a thread-on macro close-up filter, and that will help you out a bunch. In which case, I would probably go with something, again, if you're looking for the best, I would probably go with the Sony RX10, get one of the macro close-up filters, and you're going to get some really great results with that setup.
Okay, and Holly asks, can you explain why the video on the P900 handles low light so much better than regular mode?
So I'm assuming you're meaning against shooting photos, being regular mode photo versus video. That's a good question. If you're shooting automatic video, if you're just shooting video automatically, it's probably keeping you at a pretty low shutter speed. So it's meaning that your ISO is pretty low as well. So your noise performance is very clean. So you're probably seeing better low light performance because when you're doing video, typically you're not having a super fast shutter speed. Typically it's down around 1/60th or 1/125th of a second when you're recording video to get a very smooth looking video file. So that also allows to keep your ISO down lower. Whereas if you're doing any photography, you're probably going to be at a faster shutter speed, most likely, which means your aperture is going to be, or sorry, your ISO is going to be higher. So you're going to see some more noise in your images. That would be my guess as to the difference between the two of them. But if you have video files, I would look into what settings that your video was recorded at versus what settings that your images are shot at, and just compare those settings, compare the ISO, compare the shutter speed to see. And if they're very similar and you're seeing better performance still out of the video, That's a good question, because you really shouldn't see any differences if your settings are very similar to what they are when you're photographing. There's really nothing differently being done. Your sensor is just capturing images at a much faster rate. It's just images being processed much faster. So you really shouldn't see any difference if your settings are very similar to when you're taking photographs.
Okay,
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
and Bruce is asking approximate prices. So I don't know if you want to handle this from the perspective of the cameras that you presented tonight with current prices as of this month. With the cameras presented, what the lowest and the highest prices, or what
Sure.
the
Yeah. So we can do that. So I'll do kind of the current prices as of today, just kind of the low and the high end. So the low end is going to be the FZ80, which was the last one that I showcased from Panasonic. That one is on rebate right now, and that one only retails for $299. So that's kind of the low end of things, kind of the low 200s, 200, 300s. The low hundreds is kind of where these are going to start out. So I'd say you're typically looking between 300 to 500 kind of being the starting point. And then going to the high end, the Sony is going to be the highest end, which you're at about $1,600, I believe, right now. And that's kind of where it tops out. And then you have a lot of room in between at different models. So typically you're looking at between anywhere from like $300 up to about $1,600 kind of being the range that you're going to be looking at. And in this program, I kind of covered the two extremes, the high end and the low end. There's really not much lower than that FZ80, and there's nothing higher than that Sony RX10. So I kind of cover the two extremes, and then everything in between kind of falls into play.
Okay, and just to expand a little bit on what Noah just said, the main thing would be is, what is your goal for the camera? So in other words, if you're looking for maximum zoom, some of the smaller size sensor bridge cameras will get you an incredible amount of zoom. But if you're looking for higher quality in low light or no, you at least the 1-inch sensors. But of course, the cost of that is giving up zoom. I think Noah had mentioned 600 millimeters is the longest zoom on with a 1-inch sensor on a bridge camera. So really what you have to do is figure out your price point and balance that with your, what your goals are, and then figure out what the best camera is for you with those considerations in mind. The last question comes from Phil. He says, I just bought a Panasonic FZ80. The manual is hopeless. No surprise there. I give Phil credit for reading the manual first off. Do you know of a good alternative manual or website that explains things to the user? And Phil continues to say, not that tech savvy. So something that speaks more in layman's terms.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I always find videos to be so beneficial in learning anything. I'm more of a visual learner than I am somebody who learns by reading. I always find it tough to retain things that I read. So I always say YouTube is a great outlet for anything photographic. There's so much information out there, and pretty much any camera model you can think of, there's going to be tons and tons of videos on it. So I would even just go to YouTube and search something like Panasonic FZ80 quick start guide, or basic settings, or some of these terms where you're going to get just kind of a general overview of how the camera works. And then if there's more specific questions you have, oh, how do I do this? You can search those specific questions as well, and most likely find videos on them. As far as an alternative manual, nothing that I'm aware of off the top of my head specifically. I know there are some kind of book companies out there that are manufacturing kind of different guides for certain cameras. I'm not aware of any off the top of my head, any other manuals off the top of my head besides the Panasonic one. If you're having difficulty because of the size of it, you can get the PDF download of the manual from Panasonic's website. So you can download the PDF manual to be a larger size, or you can read it on your computer, or even download it onto an iPad or a tablet so you have it. But outside of that, yeah, I always recommend YouTube. I mean, I get so much information from that when it comes to photography, and it's so much better to visualize it, see somebody actually walking through it rather than having to read the menu, go back to your cameras, try to find those different settings and those features. You can actually see somebody doing it in real time, which I find to be super beneficial. So that's always a benefit that I like to recommend. And there are some videos that will be better than others, and you kind of got to pick and choose. And not all of them are going to be amazing, but for the most part, there's some really good content on YouTube for really any camera model that you may be looking at.
Okay, and Charlene and Rich write, my Canons have consistently broken down with using the zoom function. Is this a characteristic of Canon? Is there another bridge camera that I should consider?
So that is another flaw to be aware of. All these bridge cameras have electronic zooms, whereas a DSLR lens or a mirrorless lens has a mechanical zoom that you're rotating, and it's all done mechanically. However, all of these bridge cameras have an electronic zoom, so those electronic components are a lot more prone to breaking and being damaged. And if they are damaged, you can't zoom the lens in and out. It's completely broken. So even if you're just slightly bang it up against a wall, or you make a slight drop on it, if it throws the electronics out of whack or slightly shifts the electronic focusing or the electronic zoom motor, you have to send it in for repair. So they are definitely more fragile than a lot of DSLR or mirrorless cameras, because it's all electronic when it comes to that zoom lens. So that is, again, something to be aware of when it comes to the care of these cameras. Is just being a little bit more careful when you're out using them, being aware of your surroundings. Again, accidents do happen, but just trying to be cautious, because that electronic zoom is typically one of the main things that is going to break on it. And I've seen it happen more than a handful of times, people coming in and the camera was either dropped or it's banged up against something and the camera is no longer zooming. And in many cases, depending on what the price of that camera is, it's not always cost effective to send it in for repair. The cost to replace that can be pretty pricey sometimes. So something to be aware of. Again, your mileage will vary, but just take good care of your camera. Treat it like a child, I guess you could say, and take good care of it, and it will take good care of you. But again, accidents do happen, and unfortunately, these cameras are more prone to breaking because of that electronic zoom.
Okay, this is actually my question now, and it may be a dated question, because the first digital camera that I had was a bridge camera. Do any of the bridge cameras that you featured tonight have an optical and or a digital zoom? And if digital zoom is still a feature, do you want to talk about the negatives or positives?
Sure. Yeah. So I will say, when I talked about the focal lengths of these cameras, those are all optical zoom. So optical zoom means it's the lens that's actually zooming. So digital zoom is when the camera is physically cropping down to get a closer, or I guess a further distance, to zoom into a further distance. So it's cropping down on the sensor to just basically, again, crop down so you get more of that image in your frame. But every actual focal length listing on any spec sheet is going to be the optical focal length listing. Some of these cameras can go past that point, but once you get past that point, your image quality starts to very quickly drop, because all you're doing is cropping in. And if you're cropping in on, again, one of these small 1/2 sensor size cameras, you're not going to have a very high resolution file to work with, and you're not going to get a very enjoyable image when you're magnifying in with the digital zoom. So all of these have a full optical zoom up to whatever focal length that I kind of mentioned as I was going through them. And that will be listed on all of the spec sheets when you're looking at different camera models. Some of them will go further than that. They typically don't list that, but some of these cameras will have a digital zoom past that maximum optical zoom point as well.
Okay, and just a lot of very nice comments. Holly writes, thank you. Jan says, thank you, Noah. Appreciate the information. Lillian says, enjoyed the presentation. Thank you for the great information. As does Kara, says, thank you so much. Helpful information. Joe says, very informative presentation. And Marie says, thanks. Good all around information.
Noah, another
Yes.
question for you, though, that I know was on the list I sent over. And again, from what I understand, a lot of the people are interested in the bridge cameras because of the weight.
Mhm.
And let's just say some people like myself are a little aged, shall I say, or older. I like that word. So anyway, the weight does play into there. I know
Sure.
she mentioned tripods.
Mhm.
I also know, I know that Hans has several tripods, but also monopods. And if you're trying to walk around, tripods can be awkward to use. What's your thought with bridge cameras and monopods?
Yeah, yeah. Monopods are great. They're not going to give you quite as much stability as a tripod, but they will still give you a pretty good amount of stability and allow you to shoot at much slower shutter speeds. And again, if you're walking around in close quarters on any boardwalks or any areas where, again, you don't have a lot of room to work with, a monopod can be much more beneficial than a tripod. There are also some tripods that have a monopod leg on it, so it's kind of like a 2-for-1. It's increase your value even more, which I always recommend. Is if you can find a good tripod that has a detachable monopod leg, all the better. So yes, monopods are great, and you can definitely use them with these bridge cameras, and that can help with the stability of them, and also shooting in lower light conditions, being able to keep your ISO at a more reasonable level, and also being able to keep your shutter speed a little bit slower, slow enough where you can't handhold it, but not so slow where the monopod's not going to be able to stabilize it for you. So monopods can definitely be very beneficial as well. They're compact, they collapse very small, they don't weigh a ton, and they make for a nice walking stick as well if you're out hiking or doing a lot of walking around as well. So that's always nice too. So yes, monopods are another great thing to help improve any stability and also shooting in lower light conditions.
One suggestion, and again, I know that people, if you're interested, go out on Hunt's site. So there's a listing of various equipment like the tripods, the monopods, the filters that Noah mentioned. You got to look and see what do you think will work for you. I mentioned this before you came on, Noah, and I'll mention it again. The biggest thing that Hunt's has to offer, in my mind, is not just the equipment, it's the fact that the service, people like Noah are out there and they have a good amount of knowledge, which they're more than willing to share. And if you have questions, or if you happen to bang that camera, sometimes they are a good resource to talk to. In some cases, they'll fix it. Sometimes they'll recommend some other means to repair it. So bear that in mind. And again, no, I'd like to thank you and naturally pass that on to Gary.
I definitely will.
Because he's the one that's really built the whole idea of service up in Hunt since I've been dealing with him for the last X number of years.
And Noah, I'd like to say this was a great presentation. We really appreciate you helping out our group in such a great and detailed way, and providing of your time. Sounds to me like this was a brand new presentation you put together specifically for the group, and it was a great one.
Awesome.
From the comments and the questions and the number of people that attended, was definitely a topic of interest to many people.
Okay,
Awesome.
if there's no other questions, or if people have questions, please go off, unmute, and just ask it directly.
And I'll put my email down in the chat again one more time, just in case anybody still needs it. Follow up with any other questions you have, comments, suggestions, anything at all. Again, this is the first time I've done a specific camera or a specific program all about bridge cameras. So any feedback you guys have, anything you would add or change, always taking any feedback that you guys got to improve it for the future. But I'm glad that it all seemed like you really enjoyed it, and hopefully you learned a lot. Hopefully I kind of cleared up any misconceptions and kind of broke down things a little bit easier for you to understand. And yeah, if you guys have anything further or you're in the market for getting a bridge camera, reach out. I'll be more than happy to take care of you. As Jay mentioned, we're really all about that personalized service and really want to help you guys out in any way that we can, even though we may not be physically local to you. More than happy to help out in any way that we can. Ship stuff down very quickly to Florida, usually in 3 days. Any issues or any questions, anything at all, please do reach out, and I'm more than happy to help all of you.
Well, unless there's further questions, we've been just a little over an hour. And again, thank you for attending. And check out our website for the May programs that are out there. Again, I'm not going to tell you what they are, but you're going to find them interesting. And please contact Alan or myself if you have questions or comments. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
You got Noah.